In the autumn of 1891, the quiet industrial town of Millerville, Pennsylvania, was shaken by a discovery so horrific that officials sealed the records for over 3 decades. 17 people were found chained in the basement of the abandoned Millerville Opera House, their bodies marked by prolonged captivity and brutal abuse. The most chilling detail, each had been declared dead months or even years before, in 3 separate counties. The man behind this nightmare, Cornelius Vanier, had been hiding in plain sight, running what appeared to be a legitimate traveling circus for more than a decade. Beneath the bright tents and laughter of children, his cabinet of wonders concealed one of the most disturbing human exploitation schemes in American history. Local newspapers were silenced, witnesses intimidated, and corrupt officials, well paid for their compliance, kept the truth buried. Vanier, tall, sharply dressed, and charming, claimed wealthy Dutch origins in New York, though no one had verified his past. In 1887, he bought the old opera house to serve as winter quarters for his circus, which featured mesmerizing acts. Eliza, the bone serpent woman whose impossible contortions defied anatomy. Johann, the Bavarian giant, towering nearly 8 feet tall and bending iron with ease. And Mary Catherine, the singing angel. A beautiful voice paired with carefully concealed, missing arms. The audience never knew that many performers were captives taken against their will. Vanier's partners in crime were Sheriff Josiah Cromwell, who accepted $50 a month to look the other way, and Dr. Heinrich Kellerman, a fake physician skilled not in medicine, but in chemistry specifically, creating drug mixtures to keep victims docile. Together, they preyed on the vulnerable people with disabilities, orphans, immigrants with no family in America. Kellerman lured them with free medical care, drugged them with laudanum and other opiates, and transported them hundreds of miles to the opera house basement. There they were broken through abuse, manipulation, and dependency, until they believed their only purpose was to perform. The scheme might have continued indefinitely, if not for the events of October 12, 1891, when a young woman stumbled into the office of Thomas Fairchild, editor of the Millerville Weekly Gazette. Malnourished, barefoot, and bleeding, she gripped his arm with startling strength and whispered the words that would begin to unravel Vanier's empire. "They're still down there." In the darkness, they couldn't escape. The chains were too heavy. Fairchild eased the trembling young woman into a chair and handed her water, which she gulped down with desperate urgency. As she steadied herself, fragments of her story began to emerge. She spoke of cramped rooms beneath the opera house, of a man who came with needles, and bitter medicine of being forced to repeat painful movements until her body ached. She said her name was Sarah Henley, perhaps from Lancaster, but even this she seemed unsure of. They told her she was dead, she whispered, showing her forged death papers as proof. At first, Fairchild doubted her, suspecting delirium or madness. Yet the fear in her eyes, the precision of her descriptions, and her knowledge of hidden details convinced him she spoke the truth. She described the opera house basement so accurately, he knew she had been there, naming other captives with specific traits and histories no outsider could guess. The most damning revelation was of a ledger in Vanier's office listing every captive's name, origin, and purchase price entries stretching back years. Fairchild realized this was not a mere case of abuse, but a long-running criminal enterprise hidden in plain sight. Sarah had escaped by chance. Kellerman's assistant Peter had miscalculated her laudanum dose, leaving her lucid instead of sedated. When he failed to properly lock her shackles, she seized the moment and fled. She spoke of her cell wedged between 2 others, one holding Jan Brenner. The gentle Bavarian giant, abducted from Philadelphia docks, reduced to childlike dependency through drugs and fear. The other, Mary Catherine, real name Catherine Ali, born with underdeveloped arms, but blessed with a voice that once made her a hometown star in Scranton until she vanished 3 years earlier after a fake audition. Vandermeer and Kellerman's cruelty went beyond physical captivity. They erased identities, forged death certificates with the help of Sheriff Cromwell, and showed fake letters from family members expressing relief at their absence. Many captives held for years began to believe these lies. Over the next 3 days, Fairchild quietly investigated. Death records from the past 5 years revealed a chilling pattern. People with disabilities or unusual features reported dead under suspicious circumstances matched the descriptions of Vanier's performers. The timing aligned almost perfectly with the circus's route through Pennsylvania. Armed with his findings, Fairchild decided to confront Sheriff Cromwell. On October 16th, in the sheriff's cramped, tobacco-scented office, Cromwell cleaned his revolver without looking up. "I hear you've been asking interesting questions," he said. When Fairchild pressed him about the death records, Cromwell's reply was a sudden, vicious blow, with the revolver's butt dropping the journalist to the floor, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Fairchild looked up to see Cromwell towering over him, revolver aimed squarely at his head. "You're going to forget everything that crazy girl told you," the sheriff said, in a casual, almost friendly tone. "You're going to forget you ever saw her. And if I hear you've been spreading stories about respectable men like Mr. Vandermeer, well, accidents happen in mining towns, Tom. Men disappear all the time." In his arrogance, Cromwell made a fatal mistake. He had just confirmed Sarah's story while revealing his own role in the conspiracy. Even through the fear, Fairchild's instincts as a journalist sharpened. Every word Cromwell uttered was more proof of the rot that had allowed Vanier's crimes to thrive. Leaving the sheriff's office, Fairchild knew he was in mortal danger, yet he was more determined than ever to expose the truth. Local law enforcement was useless, and contacting higher authorities risked word getting back to Cromwell before anything could be done. His plan was risky, maybe suicidal. If he couldn't bring the authorities to the evidence, he would take the evidence to them and to the public. Over the next week, Fairchild and Sarah plotted an infiltration of the Opera House basement. Sarah's intimate knowledge of its layout and guard routines was vital. This wouldn't be a rescue mission. Fairchild lacked the means for that. The goal was to gather undeniable proof photographs of the cell's documentation of the captive's condition, and if possible, copies of Vanier's records. But someone was watching. Kellerman, ever suspicious and meticulous, began to suspect Sarah's escape was no accident. On October 23rd, while taking inventory of his supplies, he noticed several vials of chloroform and certain photographic chemicals, missing items with no medical purpose in his work. The realization that someone intended to document the operation sent him into a frenzy. He contacted Vanier and Cromwell, and together they enacted their emergency protocol, a plan designed for one purpose: erase all evidence, including the captives themselves. What Fairchild and Sarah didn't know was that the conspirators had already decided to strike first. On the night of October 24th, under cover of darkness, the pair approached the Opera House, unaware they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The building was as silent as Sarah had promised. She had escaped through a basement window weeks earlier, leaving it unlocked, and they slipped inside with their shaded lantern. The air was thick with the stench of filth, sickness, and a strange, sweet odor Fairchild couldn't place. Navigating the narrow maze of cells, the dim light revealed horrors worse than Sarah had described: emaciated figures marked by abuse and crude medical experimentation, some in drugged stupors who barely stirred at Sarah's whispers. Jan, the Bavarian giant, was shackled in chains so tight they had carved deep infected grooves into his wrists and ankles. Jan's once imposing frame had withered to skin and bone, his vacant eyes reflecting a mind shattered beyond repair. When Sarah spoke his name, a flicker of recognition stirred, but comprehension never followed. Catherine Ali was in even graver condition, her once celebrated voice now a ragged whisper, her throat irreparably damaged from being forced to sing while drugged. She was awake but adrift, unable to focus for more than a few seconds at a time. As Fairchild set up his camera to record the misery around them, Sarah moved between the cells, offering whispered encouragement to those still able to hear. In doing so, they uncovered something that pushed Vanier's crimes from monstrous to almost inhuman. In the Opera House's former wine cellar, they found Kellerman's laboratory, a grim workshop lined with glass bottles, syringes, and surgical instruments. Notes in German, some partially translated, detailed experiments in behavioral control, pain endurance, and what Kellerman called psychological reconstruction. The horror deepened in Vanier's office, where Sarah's description of a hidden ledger proved accurate, though its scope was far beyond her imagining. Inside were the records of 43 people acquired over 8 years, each entry listing their real name, origin, method of capture, and assigned stage identity. Notations showed how deaths were concealed and which captives were active or discontinued, a sanitized term for those who had died or been killed when they could no longer perform. 17 were still alive. 26 had vanished into the euphemism. As Fairchild photographed the pages, heavy footsteps creaked down the stairs, voices low and deliberate. The sickly, sweet smell in the air grew sharper chloroform. It was being pumped through the ventilation, and by the time Fairchild understood, it was too late. Sarah collapsed first. Fighting the drug's pull, Fairchild grabbed his camera and the most crucial pages. But his vision was already dimming. The last thing he saw was Cornelius Vanier descending with a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other, flanked by Cromwell Kellerman and 2 unknown enforcers. The realization hit him with icy clarity. He and Sarah were about to be the newest, discontinued entries in the ledger. When he awoke, he was chained in a cell like the others, his camera and documents gone. Sarah lay unconscious in the adjacent cell. The hours that followed were a descent into calculated terror. Vanier, Cromwell, and Kellerman interrogated him in shifts. Kellerman used his anatomical knowledge to inflict agonizing pain without leaving visible injuries. Cromwell favored brute force leather strap beatings near drownings in icy water and graphic threats about Sarah's fate. Yet it was Vanier who inspired the deepest fear. Vanier's method of interrogation was chillingly methodical, more like a psychological study than an attempt to extract information. He asked about Fairchild's upbringing, his ambitions, even his family history. Not out of empathy, but to assess whether the journalist could be reshaped into another act for the Cabinet of Wonders. "You have a certain presence?" Thomas Vanier mused one evening, his tone almost cordial. "Intelligent eyes, good bone structure. With the right training and adjustments, you could be compelling. I'm thinking perhaps the Scholar of Sorrows. The melancholy gentleman. A man of letters driven mad by forbidden knowledge." He spoke as if describing a business proposition, reducing Fairchild's identity and humanity to marketable traits. That casual detachment, the way he could speak of turning a man into a commodity without the faintest trace of conscience, was more terrifying than any beating. Still, Fairchild listened closely, collecting every scrap of information he could. In Vanier's offhand remarks, he pieced together the true scope of the enterprise contacts in at least 6 states, aided by a network of corrupt officials and fraudulent medical professionals who supplied a steady stream of acquisitions. The Cabinet of Wonders, it turned out, was only part of Vanier's empire. There were private exhibitions, exclusive gatherings for wealthy patrons willing to pay enormous sums for performances that were darker, more intimate, and often sexual or violent. These secret shows brought in the bulk of his profits. Fairchild also learned the full intent behind the emergency protocol he and Sarah had triggered. It was not merely about silencing them. It was about erasing Millerville entirely from the operation's history. Vanier was already arranging to move to a hidden facility in Ohio, shielded by a corrupt asylum director. The plan called for killing every captive, burning all records, and staging the accidental deaths of anyone who might link Vanier to his crimes. That list included Fairchild, Sarah, a handful of townspeople who had dared to question too much, and even Peter Kellerman's jittery assistant, now deemed a liability. Just when it seemed the nightmare in Millerville couldn't deepen, the stakes escalated. If this story is already chilling, you share it with someone who craves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to keep these investigations alive, and subscribe so you never miss another descent into America's hidden past. Vanier's fatal miscalculation was believing Fairchild was an isolated threat, an ambitious reporter chasing a story alone. He had no idea Fairchild had been quietly corresponding with Margaret Dalton, a trailblazing investigative journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer. What began as casual letters about small-town life had evolved into a covert warning system. 2 days before Sarah's escape, Fairchild had sent Dalton a letter explicitly detailing his suspicions about the Cabinet of Wonders, instructing her to alert federal authorities if she didn't hear from him within 10 days. That deadline was now closing fast. Dalton was already in motion, reaching out to her contacts in the Treasury Department and the fledgling Bureau of Investigation to ensure the truth couldn't be buried. She had also sent copies of Fairchild's letters to colleagues in Pittsburgh and New York. On the morning of October 28th, as Vanier prepared to erase all trace of his operation, a telegram arrived at the Millerville Telegraph Office addressed to Sheriff Cromwell, but intended as a covert lifeline to Fairchild. Dalton's message, carefully crafted to sound routine, read: Sheriff Cromwell conducting research for article on traveling entertainments. Require interview with Thomas Fairchild and Cornelius Vanier. Federal authorities interested in regional business practices. Arriving November 1st with documentation team. Please arrange meetings. M. Dalton, Philadelphia Inquirer. Henry Walsh, the town's talkative telegraph operator, dutifully delivered it to Cromwell, but not before gossiping about it to several locals, including the barkeeper at the Millerville Social Club. By that evening, the news had reached Vanier. The mention of federal interest and a documentation team sent him into a frenzy. His carefully insulated world of bribed sheriffs and complicit doctors would crumble under national scrutiny. Convinced Dalton already held damning evidence, he concluded that the original emergency protocol was no longer enough. In a surge of panic, Vanier opted for the most extreme plan: kill every captive, torch the opera house to destroy all physical evidence, and vanish with whatever wealth he could gather. It was a desperate, reckless decision. In his rush, Vanier failed to anticipate that this very acceleration would create openings for both his prisoners and the forces closing in from outside, openings that would soon bring his empire of cruelty crashing down. The night of October 29, 1891, began as the final act in Vanier's plan to erase his crimes. Kellerman had prepared lethal doses of morphine and strychnine, intending to dispatch all 17 captives swiftly and without noise, their bodies to be soaked in kerosene and burned with the opera house. But Peter Kellerman's jittery assistant could no longer bear the weight of his guilt. For months, he had been haunted by what he'd done. But the thought of standing by while 17 human beings were slaughtered pushed him past his breaking point. Instead of helping with the poison, Peter fled into the night, finding his way to Reverend Samuel Brooks of Millville's Methodist Church, one of the few men in town untouched by Vanier's influence. At first, Brooks dismissed Peter's wild, gasping account as the ramblings of a desperate man. But when Peter described the opera house basement in meticulous detail and named people officially recorded as dead years earlier, the Reverend began to listen. They quickly devised a plan. Brooks would wire urgent messages to the Pennsylvania State Police and the governor's office, while Peter returned to the opera house to stall the killings. Time, however, was already slipping away. Kellerman had begun the first stage of a 3-part poisoning disguising it as a routine sedative that would eventually cause apparent heart failure. Thinking fast, Peter told Kellerman that Cromwell wanted to interrogate the captives once more before their deaths, buying a few critical hours as the Reverend's telegrams sped toward Harrisburg. Meanwhile, deep in the basement, Fairchild was fighting his own battle. Though weakened from beatings and chloroform, his mind was working. He had noticed that his shackles were fastened to a section of wall, weakened by years of moisture damage. Bit by bit, with painful, deliberate pressure, he worked the anchor bolt loose, masking his efforts whenever guards passed by. As midnight neared, the pieces began to align. Fairchild wrenched the bolt free at almost the exact moment Peter was stalling Kellerman upstairs, just as state police began their journey toward Millerville. Slipping from his cell, Fairchild used the mental map he had formed during his earlier photographic mission to move unseen through the warren of corridors toward the other prisoners. What he found was both heartbreaking and enraging. Many captives were too heavily drugged or too broken in spirit to even process the chance of escape. Some held for years were paralyzed by the fear that fleeing would bring punishments worse than death. Sarah, despite her own injuries and exhaustion, became their anchor. Her earlier escape made her a figure of trust, and her familiarity with each captive's personal fears allowed her to coax even the most unresponsive toward action. Still, their bodies were frail, their movements slow, and Fairchild quickly realized that getting them out would be as much a test of will as of stealth. Johan, the gentle giant, was so wasted by hunger he could barely stand, and Catherine O'Malley's worsening respiratory illness made even short movements dangerous. Many others suffered untreated injuries or illnesses deliberately ignored by Kellerman to keep them compliant. As Fairchild and Sarah worked frantically to unshackle as many captives as possible, noise from above grew louder. Shouts, pounding footsteps, furniture scraping across the floor, signs that Vanier's final plan was already underway. The fragile calm shattered when Kellerman, suspicious of Peter's stalling, descended to check on the prisoners himself. Finding Fairchild's cell empty and several captives loose, he raised the alarm. Moments later, Vanier and Cromwell stormed into the basement with hired enforcers' guns drawn. In the cramped corridors, the captives were trapped between the men trying to free them and the men determined to keep them caged. Vanier, revolver in hand, should have pressed his advantage. But his fury clouded his judgment. Fixated on punishing Fairchild for what he saw as personal defiance, he ignored the broader threat, allowing Sarah and the more mobile captives to push toward the stairs. At the top, Peter stood ready, warning them of enemy movements and helping them slip past pockets of resistance on the main floor. Then, just as Cromwell chased Sarah and two others toward the exit, an unexpected figure stepped into his path, Reverend Brooks, flanked by 3 Pennsylvania State Police officers. Brooks had come to check on Peter's safety, unaware that the first wave of state police had arrived early thanks to a lucky rail connection. Seeing real law enforcement inside the Opera House threw Cromwell into disarray. He tried to assert his authority as sheriff, but the officers already knew of his suspected corruption. In the chaos, freed captives poured upstairs while police tried to determine friend from foe. Vanier, realizing his control was collapsing, made a last, reckless move. He and Kellerman barricaded themselves in the office, intent on destroying every piece of incriminating evidence before making a violent escape. But they didn't know Fairchild had already photographed the ledger's most damning pages, and that those images were hidden in a safe place known only to him and Sarah. The standoff inside Vanier's office dragged on for nearly 3 tense hours. By then, reinforcements from the Pennsylvania State Police had arrived, along with an official from the Attorney General's office, summoned thanks to Margaret Dalton's contacts in federal law enforcement. Outside the barricade, a scene of extraordinary significance was unfolding. 17 men and women who, according to official records, had been dead for years were alive, being photographed, examined, and interviewed by authorities. Many were in critical condition, yet most were lucid enough to recount the horrors they had endured. The deadlock broke from an unexpected source. Jan Brenner, the gentle giant long thought lost to mental ruin, suddenly seemed to awaken. When his eyes locked on Kellerman through the office window, something deep inside him ignited. In a surge of raw, unrestrained rage, he tore into the barricade. Furniture that would have taken a team of men to move crumbled under his blows, and within minutes he had cleared a gap wide enough for police to storm through. Kellerman collapsed without resistance, too drained and broken to fight. Vanish, however, was defiant to the last. When officers entered, they found him feeding papers into a small fire in a wastebasket. Without looking up, he said calmly, "Gentlemen, you're too late. Whatever crimes you think you can prove just went up in smoke." But he was wrong. Fairchild had already preserved the most damning evidence in his photographs, and the survivor's testimony combined with Peter's intimate knowledge of daily operations gave investigators a complete picture of the crimes. Sheriff Cromwell's arrest was almost anticlimactic. Confronted with irrefutable proof and multiple witnesses, he quickly tried to bargain for leniency by naming others in Vanier's network. The most unforgettable moment of that night came not from the arrests, but from the captives themselves. Catherine Ali, her voice still raw and damaged, began to sing a hymn her mother had taught her. Slowly, others joined in their voices, frail yet unbroken. The sound filled the opera house, an imperfect trembling chorus that was at once mournful and defiantly alive, a human triumph rising from years of darkness. As dawn broke over Millerville on October 30th, 1891, the true scale of Cornelius Vanier's crimes began to emerge. The 17 survivors rescued that night were only a fraction of his victims. The other 26 names in his ledger, marked discontinued, would never see justice. In the months that followed, the trials became a nationwide sensation, among the first major American prosecutions of organized human trafficking. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco reported every detail, drawing public outrage and morbid fascination in equal measure. The evidence against Vanier was devastating: photographs, ledgers, survivor testimony, and physical proof of years of captivity and abuse. He was convicted on 43 counts of kidnapping, 17 of unlawful imprisonment, and 26 of murder. His execution on March 15, 1893, drew both protest and grim approval, though few shed tears for a man who had profited from the destruction of so many lives. Dr. Heinrich Kellerman avoided the gallows by cooperating fully with investigators, earning a life sentence. His confessions exposed accomplices in 6 states and revealed the breadth of the corruption that had shielded Vanier for years. His medical records became vital in understanding the physical and psychological toll inflicted on victims, guiding their treatment and rehabilitation. Sheriff Josiah Cromwell also turned witness, implicating powerful allies in exchange for a reduced 20-year sentence. He served only 7 years before dying of a heart attack in 1899, but not before his testimony led to the removal of 3 judges, 2 county commissioners, and dozens of minor officials across western Pennsylvania. For the survivors, the aftermath was as varied as their ordeals. Sarah Henley reunited with her family and emerged as a tireless advocate for victims of human trafficking, working with law enforcement to uncover and dismantle similar networks. Jan Brenner's recovery was more fragile. The years of abuse had left lasting mental scars. But with the support of his Philadelphia church community, he managed to live independently for the rest of his life. The Millerville case not only ended a reign of terror, it also forced the nation to confront an evil it had never fully acknowledged, leaving a legacy that reshaped how America saw justice, exploitation, and the resilience of those who survive it. Jan Brenner never regained the ability to speak clearly about his ordeal. but he found quiet purpose as a handyman and gardener until his death in 1923. Catherine O'Malley's voice, permanently damaged during her captivity, never returned to its former strength. Yet she reunited with her family in Scranton and married a local merchant who had waited for her despite believing she was dead. She lived a private life until 1934, rarely discussing what had happened to her, though she maintained steady correspondence with fellow survivors. Thomas Fairchild's reporting on the Vanish case cemented his place among America's leading investigative journalists. Moving to New York, he worked for several major newspapers, always guided by the lesson Millerville had seared into him: the necessity of giving a voice to those who had none. Margaret Dalton's pivotal role in exposing the operation earned her the distinction of becoming the Philadelphia Inquirer's first female investigative correspondent. She and Fairchild continued to collaborate on cases of corruption and human trafficking, their work dismantling several more criminal enterprises before the century's end. The Millerville Opera House was demolished in 1892. Its scarred foundation left untouched for decades. In 1934, a memorial garden was planted on the site, marked by a plaque honoring the 17 survivors and the 26 victims who never saw justice. Yet the Vandermeer case's true legacy was its lasting impact on American law enforcement. It revealed the urgent need for cooperation across local, state, and federal agencies, especially in crimes crossing jurisdictional lines, and spotlighted the extreme vulnerability of marginalized communities, immigrants, orphans, and those with disabilities, to exploitation. The public outcry spurred the creation of advocacy groups and led to reforms in how missing persons cases were handled. It also prompted new regulations for traveling entertainments. Performers now had to carry proof of voluntary participation, and inspections became mandatory to prevent circuses and sideshows from concealing criminal activity. Still, even with justice served and reforms enacted, unsettling truths lingered. Cromwell's testimony confirmed that Vanier's operation was only a branch of a much larger human trafficking network stretching across the eastern United States. Many accomplices were caught, but others vanished, likely continuing their trade under new names in new towns, proof that while Millerville's nightmare had ended, the darkness it revealed was far from gone. The investigation uncovered an even darker truth. Several of the names marked as discontinued in Vanier's ledger hadn't been killed at all, but sold to other operators running similar enterprises. Despite exhaustive searches, most of these people were never located, their fates lost to time. More disturbing still was the realization that Vanier's crimes had thrived not in secrecy alone, but by feeding off deep-rooted societal prejudices. Forging death certificates for people with disabilities was all too easy. Corrupt officials were willing to take bribes to ignore the disappearances. And the public's eager consumption of spectacles that dehumanized performers created fertile ground for such horrors to flourish. In the end, the Millerville case stands as both a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a sobering warning about the atrocities that can arise when greed, prejudice, and power meet without checks or accountability. The 17 who survived the Cabinet of Wonders had their death certificates voided, their identities restored, and their testimonies preserved in the historical record. But the unanswered questions linger. How many others never escaped? How many voices remain buried in silence, their suffering erased from history? This story is a reminder that the worst monsters in history have always been human, driven by profit, sustained by corruption, and empowered by society's indifference. What do you think? Was the whole truth uncovered, or did some horrors remain hidden? If this tale gripped you, share it with someone who loves a dark mystery. Subscribe for more stories like this and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next descent into the shadows. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.